Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is author and professor Rachel Adams. I'll tell you all about Professor Adams in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what we often dismiss as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment when we exert for others. And when you do it to build community and for leadership reasons, you do it to bring people together. And we're going to Professor Adams has some terrific insights into this, and that's why she's a guest. Welcome, Professor Rachel Adams.
Thank you, John.
Great. Rachel Adams is a professor of in English in comparative literature at Columbia. Her brand new book is what we're going to be talking about is Love, Money, and Duty. She teaches and works on disability, health, humanities, race, gender, sexuality in American literature and the arts. She is published widely academically, but I see her name in all kinds of publications that you might have heard of, like New York Times, Salon, Times of London, Washington Post, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Rachel Adams, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Your last book was a memoir about having a son with Down syndrome. This new book is a little bit different, Love, Money, and Duty. What motivated you to explore this topic?
That's a great question. That's a great place to start. I wrote a memoir about the first 3 years in the life of my son with Down syndrome. And I think the subtitle of my book is important to the story of how it came to be. So it's called Love, Money, Duty, Stories of Care in Our Times. And care is the central theme. So one of the things I found as I was writing about my son's arrival, and then in the aftermath, as I started to share that book, was that I was talking about care all the time. So it wasn't just a story about my son and I, but it was about our interdependency and the whole network of people and organizations and relationships that we built together to support us and that we began to contribute to. And so I wanted to think about that theme in broader terms. So it was not just about my own story, but it was about, what stories are other people telling about care? Where is care meaningful in our society beyond parent-child relationships? And who are some of the thinkers who can help me to understand the history and philosophy of care? So that's sort of the genesis.
Great. Now let's explore this concept, the subtitle. I love it when the subtitles can resonate, as yours does, Stories of Care in Our Times. And I think you play with the topic of time. So our times, what does that mean? And then there's another meaning of time as in care. How did that come about, Rachel?
So time was not where I started, but it ended up being an important concern in everything that I wrote for the book. So I focus on our times because I want to understand, I feel that I found some good in the research that I did, but I also found we are living in a world of very broken care systems and insufficient care resources. And so I wanted to understand both the present that we live in, what are the values and priorities that have caused us to end up in this situation. It's sometimes described as if it's like an inevitable shift, like climate change. And, there are demographic shifts, but I also think it's about our values. I wanted to go back historically to some of the histories that might help me to understand the present. But I also realized that care prompts us and sometimes forces us to rethink our understanding of time, because so often care runs counter to the time of the clock, the time that we use in the modern world to measure, billable hours and development of people and concepts, the constant need to be rushing from one place to another. Care often forces us to slow down, whether that's wanted or unwanted. It doesn't often, a paid caregiver is not able to fit the work that they need to do within the time that goes on a punch card. We have difficulty evaluating care work and its significance because it doesn't fit with our standards of productivity and efficiency and modern moralities.
Right, that fascinating exploration. Now, you said something that intrigues me because I honestly hadn't talked about it. Because you talked about stories of care, and you mentioned you did a historical concept. So, broadly, how has the nature of care we exert for whomever changed over time? So,
So one of the interesting insights, so this is not my own research, but this is what I learned from reading the work of a bunch of historians. One of the interesting insights I gained is that, first of all, the concept of care is historical. And who we think of as needing care, how we value the care that is given and received, and whether we think of that care as work or obligation, as my title suggests, love, money, or duty, those are all historical phenomena. So I read some historians who pointed me back to a time when dependency, which we think of as, unless you're a child, it's a very bad thing to be dependent. Nobody wants to be dependent. We are a society that values independence. So, but there was a time when most people were considered dependents. So under feudalism, there was a lord, and part of the lord was an elite person who was seen as, superior to everyone else, but also felt that, it was almost always a man, responsibility in the world was to care for his feudal subjects who were dependent, and that was everybody else. And then there was sort of a sliding scale. So then there was within the family, children were dependent and parents were there to take care of them. There was a patriarch whose job was to take care of the family. And over time, with the rise of capitalism, with the emergence of a market economy, with changing ideas about work, dependency came to be a category that was increasingly associated with people who were outcast and were unable to contribute. And this became built into a lot of the language of the welfare state. And so
mhm.
there was a difference between being a dependent, who was a person who was sort of taking, reliant on the state, and being a claimant, so like a senior citizen who has paid in, or a veteran, maybe you have done a duty and then you have the right to claim certain entitlements for yourself. So so that's one of the ways that care is historical.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating because I hadn't really framed it that or even conceived of it as that way. But I know that just my own perception is certainly late 19th to the 20th century, early 20th century America. Most, if there were children, dependent children, or maybe elders, if we lived that long enough, they were cared for by the family. Am I correct in that or not? So,
No, that is absolutely true.
yeah.
Although that is also historical because, for many people, um, childhood, so, adolescence really only became a thing in the 1950s. Before that, like many people, as soon as you were autonomous, you would go to work. You might be doing chores in the family, but you might also be working in a factory. It was only certain children who could even afford to go through
Mhm.
school. And then at the other end of the spectrum, the elderly, there simply were just far fewer elderly people because we didn't have the health care to allow people to live into, what we consider now a typical old age.
Right. So, well, I'm in that now because I'm a senior citizen, definitely. So,
Congratulations.
yeah, I made it. Now, one of the themes in your book of love, money, and duty is the arts. Why did you make that a topic? Why did you weave it through your book? How is it relevant to the topic of care? So,
Well, I'll say, like, in the most practical terms, that I'm a literary crit and cultural critic, and so I study the arts, and
mhm,
that's what I know. But the reason I do that is because I feel, I mean, first of all, I think the arts are essential to having a, healthy and robust culture. But also because arts are the places where we work through and represent the things that are most important to us as a culture. So that's the place where we can express our, deepest fantasies and desires and fears. Uh, that's a place where we can train ourselves to see the world and to see the world differently. And seeing, I mean here metaphorically, hear, experience, what have you. And so one of the ways I came to understand the problems of care that are central to my book was as at bottom, like, obviously there are tremendous social and political challenges to changing our broken systems of care. But underlying that is a fundamental failure of imagination. We can't imagine dependency as anything other than, a tragedy that befalls people other than children. We see care work as drudgery. Caregivers who care for the people we love most are also the most undervalued, poorly compensated members of our society. So that is all about a failure of imagination. Well, how do you understand and address a failure of imagination? You go to art. And so that's the best answer I can give for why the arts. And I really came to understand my book as a kind of listening tour through the arts and culture of the 20th and early 21st century, and sort of sharing back what I had learned from a whole range of artists and authors, etc.
now, when you speak of the arts, it's a big term. Is there any one particular art, i.e., music or uh, film or novels that illustrates your points most vividly, or are all arts equal?
Oh, that's a
No.
great question. I have to confess, I am like a complete tin ear. I really don't understand music. So I don't talk much about music in the book, but I talk about many different art forms. I'm a literary critic. I teach, literature classes. So literature is really important to me. And I think once I started thinking about care, I found that pretty much any literary text that I read was about care in one way or another. And so I actually think of care as a kind of reading method too. But I'm also interested in the differences between one form of media and another, and what you can learn from going back and forth, say, between a novel and a memoir and a photograph, a portrait, or a photo series, a film, a comic. I talk about several graphic artists who do comics about care, and how each art form has different lessons to teach us what
Oh,
I call the affordances of the form.
oh, great. Now, giving back to the historical bent in your book, you pick a time that is vivid to certainly my generation, having at that time lived in Los Angeles, the AIDS crisis. So, why did you want to explore that topic in the context of your book, Love, Money, and Duty? So,
Oh, that's a great question. I should say also, just coincidence, I was also living in Los Angeles during that time, and I sort of came of age, like first generation to receive the kind of sex ed that was cast in terms of AIDS, witnessing people dying of mysterious illnesses. I mean, first I was drawn to AIDS because I lived through COVID during, a certain amount of the work on this book. And as someone who's interested in history, I wanted to look back at other times when, I mean, COVID was a very strange time to be writing this book, because I desperately wanted to work on it, but I also found caregiving was, entwined with every aspect. Like my whole family was just there in my space. Um, but I looked back to AIDS as a similar moment when care came to the forefront for particular populations. And I was especially interested in, I wanted to write a chapter about family. And I wanted to talk about the burdens and expectations on our sort of legal and biologically defined families, but also to talk about chosen family. And so AIDS, like one of the horrible coincidences of the AIDS moment is that it came, so we had the sexual revolution. We started to have, gay and lesbian rights. And then we had this epidemic. So people who for the first time were able to come out and live as couples or live as part of chosen families were then often stricken, like otherwise healthy people. And you had lots of partnerships where maybe both partners would have AIDS and one cares for the other until death, and then the other. So I found that care came to the forefront in writing and other representations of that moment in a way that was very powerful because it was also kind of cut loose from the assumptions about family and what families are supposed to do of other representations of care. Often gay men who were dying of AIDS had also been rejected by their biological families, and there's certain patterns to the narratives that are quite devastating about how those families respond. There are also some quite beautiful stories of families, both partners and biological families stepping in to care. So it just was, it was an important touchstone in the book.
great. No, it's interesting because I'm pondering your book and the love, money, duty. I get the love part, and you alluded to that with gay couples that both were stricken and they cared for one another, of course. But and then the family would step in if available. If so, what is what's the obligation, i.e., the duty? What does your research tell you, Rachel? So
Oh, well, I mean, I would say that perhaps the majority of, well, I don't want to hazard a percentage, but equal distribution. So sometimes we care for those we love, but a lot of the care work we do is for money or out of a sense of duty. So, parents are legally obligated to
Hmm.
care for their children. And so I start with mothers and the great ambivalence that mothers experience. So I think, motherly love, like it's often held up as a paradigm for care, mother child. Um, but many women, also feel extremely uh, limited and resentful because of the assumptions that they will be, because if you give birth, or even if you're not a biological mother, that because you're a woman, you're more um, naturally prone to care. So there is a considerable amount of duty involved in parenting. There also have been some interesting, feminist calls, perhaps performative, but that women should be paid for the care work that they do. That was a thing in the 70s, wages for housework. But then I am also interested in paid care work and in all kinds of care that is less anticipated. So when you become a parent, obviously there are unwanted pregnancies, but you do something to become pregnant, and then you carry a child, and you prepare, and then you're a parent. But most care relationships are not planned and involve some degree of burden. So you may marry or become in a long-term relationship with a completely healthy person who then, we all live in a very temporary state of health, that person becomes disabled. You may have a parent who's in decline. I mean, there's all kinds of situations that I discussed throughout the book where people are caring out of more a sense of duty than because that's what they want to be doing. And I really want to foreground that, because I feel like it's essential to understanding, and if we're ever going to solve our problems of care, to understand the bad feelings and the neutral feelings as well as the good ones, not to idealize it.
No, I think that's a very important point, because when we look at people, topic that I know of and live through because of my age is elder care. And so, um, so many of my generation have cared for their parents in one way or another. My sisters were very loving and caring of my mother in her later years. And it is a duty, but it's okay to acknowledge the hard parts. I think, is that what you're saying? So, and it's not, don't romanticize the time constrictions or the burdensome and the challenges. I think, is that what you were getting at,
Yes.
Rachel? Yeah. So.
Absolutely. And I noticed you said your sisters cared lovingly for your parents. There was a Stanford study that found that the best way to guarantee that you would be cared for in old age was to have a daughter. Because, of course, these obligations are gendered. Even if you're the most progressive person in the world, we live in a culture that I think people still believe that women are more somehow naturally predisposed to care. And if not, their social roles somehow oblige them to do the majority of the work.
There's
And I
no
think
question.
that
Yeah.
myself. I have boys, so I
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
how well I'll be cared for.
Yeah.
I love them dearly, but
Oh, that's good. Well, please know there are many, many male nurses, and so so that's a positive there.
well, there are absolutely, and I do want to say, because I've been a little bit of a gender essentialist, that I am constantly, I mean, this is another reason I'm interested in the AIDS moment, is that it was more often than not men caring for men. So I am very interested both in situations where those dichotomies are unsettled, but I also am interested in people who don't identify in traditional ways with one gender or another. So I'm glad I got a chance to clarify that.
That's great. It's an important topic. So, I think it's a thing is explored why you wrote this book. What's been the impact? What are you hearing from the readers, or what have you learned from having written it? So,
So one of the things I've found that is not exactly what I expected. Although now that it's happened, it's utterly predictable that I share the topic in my book and it immediately elicits other people's care stories. So everybody, of course, we've all been cared for or we wouldn't be alive. But almost all of us have also been caregivers of one kind or another. Often these scenarios are extremely emotionally complicated, sometimes financially, ethically. And so people want to talk about them and they feel liberated to do that. If I give a reading, I will often find someone saying, I never thought about it in this way before, or I've never told this story, but dot dot dot. I have this aunt who, or there was this time when and so I'm finding that incredibly meaningful because part of why I wanted to write this book was to have time to sit with these stories. And I have a thing, obviously, stories are not going to solve the world's problems, but they are certainly a way of giving narrative form to the things we care about and starting to rethink some of our deepest assumptions. So I have really enjoyed that, and I hope
okay.
that continues.
Yeah.
But I do tell people I am no expert in solving your care problems. So I can listen with sympathy, I can respond, but I don't take my advice as that of an expert.
No, but I'm guessing one of the themes that when people come up to you is, because I'm pretty sure you explored in your book, is perhaps people who are well-intentioned and took care of their parents or a sibling or a child. They feel maybe ashamed of some of the resentment they might feel or so. And by your exploring that, that's liberating. Am I correct with that, Rachel? So,
I think it's very important for us to accept those feelings. And because we tend to idealize, and so I look out for those feelings. So I love, like, Adrienne Rich, the poet, talks about how sometimes she was angry as a mother.
mhm.
That lots of mothers are, and so I will take those moments and I will quote them. Or you are sitting, so I talk about being with my father as he was dying and wanting to feel present in the moment, and attunement is a big thing that feminist critics talk about in terms of care, idealizations of care. I did not feel attuned. I felt I was he had no fat left on his body. So the room was stiflingly hot. I was so thirsty. I was so tired. I was scared. I didn't know anything about, caring for someone before death. And I also felt guilty because I felt like I should be. I know our time is very limited. I wish I could be otherwise. I thought about, I will write about this in my book, and I look forward to a time when I'm sitting in my, climate controlled space typing on my computer about this and not living through it. So I share that because I think it's important. It liberates other people to talk about having those feelings. It doesn't
Well,
mean
I
I
would.
love my father or I
No.
wasn't
Not
sorry.
at all. I would call that a moment of grace, and you maybe have already trumped me because I'm going to, as you know, I ask every guest a story about grace. Do you have one that you'd like to share, Rachel? So,
I do. I really appreciate that question because it's not something I don't use that term very much, but I think you have brought my attention to its importance to my book. So, but I'm going to say two things. So one of them is that when my son was born, my disabled child, I felt, completely unmoored. I had no idea what to do. I felt like I was on a very steep learning curve. And so every person who offered me help of any kind, starting with the, social workers in the hospital, I took it. And there's nothing that came naturally to me at all. I like to be a very independent, self-sufficient person. So one lesson I learned is the gift of asking for help. People love to be asked for help. And it's something that's incredibly hard to do. And I think that is when it's done right, it can occasion a moment of grace on both sides, both the person who's asking, who's, occupying that humbling position of vulnerability, and the person who gets to give. But I also want to call out the people. So one of the things I write about in my memoir is that having a disabled child who had so many needs brought into view a whole class of people that I just had never thought about before, the kind of people who have dedicated their lives to caring for people in need, people who are vulnerable, people who are devalued. And those people, to me, the kind of care they showed my family, the hope they gave us, the selflessness, to me, that is the definition of grace. I can't think of more gracious work.
Well, what a two powerful stories, and yes, asking for help. It is perceived as, oh, I don't want to be a burden, or I'm embarrassed, or whatever. And thank you for shining a light on that. And so, Professor Rachel Adams, how can people find you and the book, Love, Money, and Duty?
So the book is published by Columbia University Press, and you can buy it through the website. You can also buy it at any online bookstore. I am on Twitter, Blue Sky, and X under the handle Rachel Adams 212. I also have a website that is in the process of being revamped, but it should be new and improved very shortly at racheladams.net.
We will put that in the notes. And with that, we're going to close out. And it has been a privilege to interview you, Rachel Adams, about your new book, Love, Money, and Duty. And with that, we'll go out. So
thank you so much.